Sawate Omnes, and welcome to week 3 of remote teaching. I hope you all are staying healthy. Today we will be focusing on Wheelock Chapter 36, which introduces the new subordinate subjunctive clause, the adjective noun clause, and another regular verb, theo. Let's begin. Let's start with how we can define, recognize, and translate adjective noun clauses. Adjective noun clauses are subordinate clauses that answer the question, what was ordered, requested, or advised. It is called a noun clause because the whole clause is replacing the noun that would be the direct object of the verb. It is kind of hard to recognize because it looks almost exactly like a purpose clause. It is a subordinate clause introduced by ut or ne if the clause is negative and has a subjunctive verb. The subjunctive verb is usually in the present or imperfect tense. However, there is one thing that sets it apart from purpose clauses. The verb in the main clause will be one of ordering, requesting, or advising, a very specific subset of head verbs. Because it is introduced by a head verb, this construction is also known as an indirect command, because it reports indirectly what was commanded, just like an indirect statement reports indirectly what was said, and an indirect question reports indirectly what was asked. Some of the verbs that can introduce adjective noun clause / indirect command are hortor, I urge, impero, I order, moneo, I warn, oro, I ask, persuadio, I persuade, peto, I ask or I seek, quairo, I ask, and rogo, I ask. It is very easy to translate. Ut is translated as to and ne as not to, and the verb as if it were a present infinitive, regardless of its tense and number. Now let's look at a few examples of this. First, let's refresh ourselves on some ways Latin does direct commands. The first of these is the imperative, as is seen in the sentence hoc facite, do this, with facite being the plural present imperative of facio. A second way to directly command someone in Latin is the jussive subjunctive, which is the use of the subjunctive as a main verb, not in a subordinate clause. This can be seen in the example of hoc faciant. That ia in faciant tells us that this verb is subjunctive, and since it is not in a subordinate clause, it has to be a jussive subjunctive. It is translated as let them do this. Now let's see how the jussive noun clause / indirect command differs. The first example we have is imperat vobis ut hoc faciatis. The head verb of commanding, advising, or requesting that triggers the jussive noun clause is imperat, which, as you'll recall from last week, is one of those special verbs that takes a dative for its object, which is why vobis is in the dative. The subordinate clause is introduced by ut and has the present subjunctive faciatis. Following the rules of translation from the previous slide, we translate ut as to and faciatis as the infinitive to do, making the jussive noun clause translate as to do this, and the whole sentence as he commands you to do this. Our next example is petitit ab eis ne hoc facerent. The special head verb of asking, commanding, or requesting is petitit, he begged. Peto is odd in that when you are asking for something from someone, you use an ablative separation, which is why the object is ab eis. However, this can just be translated as them to make the sentence make more sense. Now we move on to the subordinate clause, this time introduced by ne and including the imperfect subjunctive facerent. Remember, following the sequence of tenses, sentences that have a verb of the perfect system in their main clause can only ever have an imperfect or pluperfect subjunctive with them. Petitit is perfect, which is why facerent is imperfect. Following the translation rules from the previous page, we translate ne as not and facerent as to do, meaning the indirect command translates as not to do this, and the full sentence as he begged from them, or he begged them, not to do this. Our final example is hortatus est eos ut hoc facerent. The head verb of asking, advising, requesting, ordering, etc. in this sentence is hortatus est. The jussive noun clause is introduced by ut, and because our main verb is perfect, the subjunctive is the imperfect facerent. The jussive noun clause is translated as to do this, and the whole sentence as he urged them to do this. This chapter also introduces the irregular verb fio fieri factus sum, which means to occur, to happen, to be done, or to be made. It is most often used in place of the present passive system of facio. It is kind of like the opposite of a deponent in that it is active in form, but passive in translation. This means that fit, the third person singular present active indicative, is used more often than facitor, the third person singular present passive indicative facio, to mean it is done or it is made. It does not have its own perfect system, but instead uses the perfect passive forms of facio. When translating, when you see these active forms, remember that they are translated as passive, and that the passive perfect forms of facio can now also mean has become or has occurred. Now let's go through the conjugation of fio. First, let's look at the present in the indicative and the subjunctive. In the present indicative, the first person singular is fio, the second person singular is fit, the second person singular is fis, the third person singular is fit, the first person plural is fimus, the second person plural is fitis, and the third person plural is fiant. It is translated as I am made, you are made, he, she, it is made or done, we are made, y'all are made, and they are made or done. In the singular, the imperative is fi and the plural is fite, be done. Now on to the subjunctive. Fiam in the first person singular, fias in the second person singular, fiat in the third person singular, fiamus in the first person plural, fiatis in the second person plural, and fiant in the third person plural. Although subjunctives are translated differently based on what type of clause they are in, for the purpose of this lecture, I will say that it is translated as I may be done, you may be made, he, she, it may be made or done, we may be made, y'all may be made, and they may be made and or done. But remember, the may is optional. Now for the imperfect in the indicative and subjunctive. Let's start with the indicative. Fie bom in the first person singular, fie bos in the second person singular, fie bot in the third person singular, fie bomus in the first person plural, fie botis in the second person plural, and fie bont in the third person plural. It is translated as I was made, you were made, he, she, it was made or done, we were made, y'all were made, and they were made or done. The imperfect subjunctive is formed just like the imperfect subjunctives of deponent verbs. You have to create what a present active infinitive would look like, since fieri is passive in form. The fictional present active infinitive of fieri would be fieri with an e at the end, and then we just add the personal endings to that. Fierem in the first person singular, fieres in the second person singular, fieret in the third person singular, fieremus in the first person plural, fieretis in the second person plural, and fierent in the third person plural. As with the present, the imperfect subjunctive is translated in accordance with what sort of clause it is in, but for the purposes of this lecture, I will say that it is translated as I might be made, you might be made, he, she, it might be made or done, we might be made, y'all might be made, and they might be made or done, but that might is optional. Finally, we have the future indicative. It is fiam in the first person singular, fies in the second person singular, fiet in the third person singular, fiemus in the first person plural, fietis in the second person plural, and fient in the third person plural. It is translated as I will be made, you will be made, he, she, it will be made or done, we will be made, y'all will be made, and they will be made or done. Finally, as I mentioned before, the perfect system of fio is just the perfect passive system of facio. The fourth principal part of facio, factus plus the forms of sum in the perfect, plus the forms of eram in the pluperfect, and plus the forms of ero in the future perfect. Now let's take a quick look at how fio and facio differ in translation. First, let's take hoc facit versus hoc fit. Both facit and fit are third-person singular present active indicatives. However, because fit translates as passive, hoc has different functions in each sentence. With facit, it is the direct object. He does this. With fit, it is the subject, since fit is translated passively. This is done. The same thing can be seen in the future. He will do this versus this will be done, and the subjunctive, let him do this versus let this be done. Finally, let's see the difference in indirect statement. In dicit eum hoc facere, eum is the subject of facere, and hoc is the direct object, and the sentence is translated as he says that he is doing this. However, with fieri, since it is passive, hoc is the subject and there's no need for the eum, so the sentence is translated as he says this is being done. Finally, let's look at a sample parsing, identifying, and translating sentence. Facendum est nihil de nihilo posse fieri. The main verb is est, which is the third person singular present active indicative. It is part of a passive periphrastic / gerundive of obligation construction with the gerundive / future active participle facendum, which is neuter nominative singular in agreement with the implied subject it. Because facendum est is a head verb and is followed by an infinitive, we have an indirect statement. The verb of this indirect statement is the present active infinitive posse that has the present active infinitive fieri as a complementary infinitive. The subject of this infinitive combo is nihil, which is a neuter accusative singular. Remember that in indirect statement, the subject of the infinitive is in the accusative. There is no direct object, but instead the prepositional phrase de nihilo. De takes the ablative, meaning that nihilo is ablative neuter singular. Putting this all together, the sentence is translated as, it must be admitted that nothing is able to be made from nothing. That's all for this chapter, folks. For homework, be sure to do your forum sentence by end of day Tuesday, read chapter 37 before watching the next video, and complete and turn in the chapter 36 worksheet by the end of the day Friday. If you have any questions or anything, please email me. Volete omnes.